All right, wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us for an HRAI YouTube HRAI webinar, PFAS Regulatory Overview with Craig Howard, Senior Regulatory Expert with Assent. My name's Matthew Bradford, your HRAI webinar host. And just a few seconds, I'm going to get Craig in here to talk us through his presentation. First, just a couple of housekeeping items. This is an interactive presentation. Towards the end of it, we will be asking you to put your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen or the chat box, and we'll get to as many as we can. Also, this is being recorded, so if you'd like to watch it again, you can watch it on HRAI's YouTube page or share it with your companies, and we definitely encourage you to do so. With that said, I would like to call Craig onto the big screen right now.
Hey, Matt.
There he is. Hey, Craig, how's it going?
I'm doing well, thanks.
Thank you so much. I was daring to actually pronounce what PFAS stands for, but can you tackle that for me?
Yeah, I can. It's per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And actually, I think I have a slide right up the start that will that we address sort of the basics of what PFAS is. So we'll get into that. But yeah, so pay attention, Matt. You might learn something, huh?
Sounds good. I'll let you take it.
All right, thanks. Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks again, Matt, for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me to share some information with you guys. I'm a senior regulatory expert at Assent. I will give a little bit about information about what Assent is and does at the end here, but I'll just jump right into it because I know PFAS is something that is on a lot of people's minds, and it's in the news a lot, and people are really paying attention to it. And I'm sure it's probably you're thinking about it and you're signed up for this webinar. So yeah, you need to understand it. So I'm going to start off with some basics of what it is, as I mentioned, and then we'll get into the actual specific some of the regulations that have come out recently. We'll touch on some regulations in the United States, regulations in Canada, of course, and then some U.S. state specific actions that are happening, which happen to be exploding lately. And then so we'll talk about what might be required of you to meet some of these obligations. And I'm even going to touch on refrigerants, which is not something that we normally touch on, but I know it's probably important to a lot of you. And then we'll get into the Q&A at the end. So with that, we'll jump into it. So yeah, so per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, right? So that's PFAS. So really what this is, right? These are a family of synthetic chemicals that were created in the 40s. They're really fantastic for a lot of uses, and that's why they've proliferated throughout almost all manufacturing sectors. They have this tight carbon fluorine bond, right, that makes them very stable and very heat resistant and that sort of thing. And we'll get into that as well. But the downside is, though, right there, it's turned out that there are some environmental and health degradation health issues with these substances. Some of them turn out to be carcinogenic. And they last forever, both in the environment, in our bodies. They just don't break down because of that tight carbon fluorine bond. So what that really means is that yes, they're in use because they don't break down, but that also leads to these negative effects. So again, I touched on these already a little bit, right? Why do we use these at all? What's the main benefits? Well, they're right there, right? They're water repellent, anti-condensation. They're very chemically inert, meaning aggressive chemicals do not eat away at them. Non-stick, of course, you're probably familiar with that part of it. Non-stick and slippery. They're electrically stable. They're resistant to UV. Like, these are all fantastic reasons to use these substances in your products, and that's why they have proliferated. But again, there are the downsides. So that's why we're seeing these regulations pop up that are starting to address this. Some of the common uses, and again, this is not an exhaustive list, but some of the common uses of these substances are listed here on the slide. But certainly electronics are probably the number one. You see them in all manner of wiring harnesses and wiring connections and things like that, because they have flame retardant abilities. They resist, again, all those performance characteristics are that's why they're being used, right? Gaskets, seals, and O-rings are another huge use. Anytime if you think about if you're using some sort of aggressive lubricant or an aggressive agent to like a degreaser or something, and you need to have an O-ring that's going to resist that, those are almost certainly going to be PFAS type O-rings. But then all down the line and down into packaging, food service packaging, which obviously doesn't pertain to you so much, but other types of packaging as well. If there's like grease-proof packaging for some reason, that's probably going to be PFAS. So again, so some of this is of course relates to the actual materials that you manufacture and put on the market, but it may be that they're also being used in your manufacturing process, right? So think about those same O-rings being used in the machinery that you use, even simple things down to like fork trucks and stuff. As these substances start to get phased out by different regulations, we're going to see some issues where you're going to have to requalify machinery if they're qualified to use these specific materials. They're going to react differently to an O-ring, for example, that has different properties. So think about that when you think about all these substances and how wide ranging they are in your industry. So that was a little bit of background on what these substances are. I'll jump into some of the regs now. So here in the United States, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, a couple years back initiated this data collection, data call so what they're trying to do is collect data on these substances, on where they're being used, who's bringing them into the country, who's manufacturing them, that sort of thing. Canada's actually has done something very similar, and I'll touch on that in a moment. Here in the United States, though, the reporting obligation will open up. It'll actually start this coming summer on July 11th, 2025. And there'll be a 6-month window of time where if you're in scope, if your business is in scope and you need to report, then you'll have 6 months to collect data and log into the system and report that to the EPA. And this is mandatory if your company is in scope for the reporting obligation. The interesting wrinkle that they've done here, though, is, again, I alluded to this. This is a data look back, they refer to it as. So they're actually looking for data, not what you're using today. They want to know what you used from 2011 to 2022, which is a huge chunk of time and a huge burden to a lot of industries. But that's what they've chosen to do. So with that, I'll get into some of the specifics of what they're looking for, what type of information they're looking for. But first, I think it's important to point out that, yes, this is about the manufacture of these substances. And you might say, well, we don't manufacture PFAS. We might use it, but we've never manufactured it. Well, the EPA here in the United States, across the board under the Toxic and Substance Control Act, or TSCA, they refer to importation of articles as manufacturing. So like if you're bringing in a component from overseas or into some other country into the United States, and it contains one of these substances, or it did contain one of these substances, again, this is a look back period, then you would actually be in scope, quote unquote, as a manufacturer of that product. It's a little convoluted, but that's fairly common under TSCA, this import as manufacturer definition. I touched on the dates for submissions. There are a few exemptions. I don't think the exemptions that I'm aware of apply to your industry so much, but something to keep in mind. And let's see, so the substances, I guess that's the other thing, right? So at the top, we talked about how PFAS is a family of thousands and thousands of substances. The EPA has chosen to, instead of providing a list of substances, they've chosen to say, hey, look, here's a definition, a chemical structure definition, that if any substance that you may have used fits into that definition, then it's in scope to be reported to us. That's pretty challenging for a lot of industries to deal with. And the EPA recognizes that. So what they have also done then is they said, look, while that's true, while it is the structural definition, they've also provided, they've come out and said, look, we think there's about 1,400, 1,500 substances that probably fit that chemical structure. But they're leaving it open to say, hey, if you happen to be using something that's not one of these 1,400, we want to know that too. So again, this is definitely a challenge for a lot of industries. So if you're saying, how are we going to do this? You're not alone. The other interesting wrinkle here is there's no de minimis value, meaning there's no like lower threshold at which if you were below that threshold you wouldn't have to report. They want all information reported down to the most minute amount of the substance, if you happen to know that, right? So you'll see as I get into the Canada side that they've done it a little bit differently. But yeah, so for under the TSCA reporting, it's there's no de minimis. They want to know all the uses of those substances. And again, for your situation, it's most likely would be in articles that you happen to bring into the United States or import in the United States during that time period, potentially. So I want to touch on what should you like? What does the EPA want you to do here, right? And this is actually gonna mirror what the Canadian regulatory authorities have said as well. And they refer to like due diligence, right? So like how much effort should you go to collect this information? The EPA points out what they refer to as a reasonable inquiry. And really what they're getting at is they're saying that they want companies to make an effort to collect this data. They expect you to they don't let me point out also they do not expect companies to send products out and get it tested at a laboratory. That is not within scope of what they're looking for here. It's not really feasible, right? It's not feasible for a couple reasons. Let's just leave it at that, though. It's not particularly feasible with today's testing capacity for these substances. But what the EPA has said, though, is that they expect these reasonable inquiries would include things like phone calls or email inquiries to your supply chain. You know, internal document reviews. If you happen to have documentation about products that you bought, they expect you to do that type of legwork to find out what you can about these substances. And then they also are very clear that they expect and they encourage manufacturers who are in scope here to document all the activities that you've done to meet this due diligence requirement. And what does that mean? Is like it really just means that whatever steps you take, up to and including like even like educating yourself, like participating in a webinar, so hey, we don't understand what this is at all. Let's teach ourselves. Document what you've done. Document that maybe if you do start making phone calls to past suppliers or your current suppliers asking this type of thing, document all that you've done, so that in the event they do have questions about what you submitted or maybe didn't submit because maybe you found that there was nothing to report or that you were not in scope. If you have that documented, then you'll be comfort in knowing that you've done your due diligence, your evidence is bulletproof, and that you're good to go. So I think that's an important point to document what you've done as you go through this process. And it'll be the same thing if you've gone down the road of the Canada reporting obligation, which we'll touch on in a moment. You'll see it's the idea is similar. They want companies to reach back into their supply chain and ask the pertinent questions and document whatever response or even lack of response that you did receive. I'm going to move to the Canada obligation or under SEPA. So in July last year, so not even a year ago, Environment and Climate Change Canada issued a notice under Section 71 that is very similar in that it requires in-scope companies to submit data to the agency about the PFAS substances that they either manufactured or imported into Canada during a specific time period. The difference is that they only gave from the date that they published this notice, they only gave companies 6 months to collect data. So the notice was published in July of last year, and they actually ran the window of time to submit data to Environment and Climate Change Canada was only 6 months. They gave companies through January 29th of 2025 to submit this. And you're saying, well, hey, but what about, that's 3 months ago. What am I going to do? Well, you may have received an exemption, or not an exemption, an extension that allowed you to submit data out into the summertime. We've heard a lot of that where companies were able to submit a request to the agency and say, hey, look, we need more time. And then the agency came back and granted most companies that requested it an additional 6 months. So a lot of companies now have into this summer to get this data collected and reported to the agency. So there's a couple bullet points in the middle of the screen there that I think are important, and we can share the links to the one for sure. But they do have a downloadable template that if you're not aware, you can go to the website and download a spreadsheet template. And it's actually relatively user-friendly to fill the data in if you have data on it. It's just, you download the template and it kind of walks you through what the steps are needed and what data is needed in each step. But additionally, there's the guidance manual you see on in the middle there. That's a really helpful document. So if you're not familiar with that, I'll make sure that we share the link to that guidance document as well, because we've found it to be a very useful and very well-written guidance document that walks you through why you have to report, walk you through what you have to report, how to do it, that sort of thing. So again, if you're not familiar with that, we'll make sure that it's that you get a link to that as well. The other main difference between this and the EPA's reporting obligation, though, is that, remember, I referred to that chemical structure, like they didn't provide a list of substances, they called out a chemical structure. Well, Environment and Climate Change Canada chose to go a different route. They actually provided a list of 312 different substances, including CAS numbers that companies need to focus on. So that's actually quite a benefit in that it gives you a finite list of substances to focus on. And if you happen to use substances that don't fall into that list of 312 that are listed, they're not concerned about those. There is an option to report it anyway, but you're not obligated to report those. The other main difference between this and the reporting that's required here in the United States is that this reporting is only for the calendar year 2023. So you may recall I said that the EPA's reporting goes from 2011 to 2022, which is a huge window of time. Environment and Climate Change Canada chose to just say they focused on calendar year 2023 business only. So if you just started using some of these substances and you know it, but it's 2025, you have nothing to report. There's no obligation to you. But again, if you were doing business in 2023 and you happen to be maybe importing these substances into Canada in that time frame, then you need to consider if you are in scope of this reporting obligation as well. I touched on some of the main differences, right? So this is one other interesting wrinkle, and it may impact your industry, is that the Canada reporting obligation includes a use phase, meaning they want to know if maybe you didn't manufacture the substance and maybe you didn't import the substance into Canada, but maybe you just used the substance in another process in 2023, like you bought it from a domestic source or a Canadian source, used it in your process, and that's it. They want to know that as well. So that's one of the reporting requirements as well. That's a little bit different from the EPA's reporting here in the States. There are de minimis levels here, meaning there is a threshold at which if you are you imported, below that threshold, that you may not have to report. So that's different as well. And then, I get this question a lot, but yes, of course, compliance to this reporting obligation is mandatory. They call out very specific violations that may affect businesses who either choose not to or maybe just didn't know about it. So those penalties, as you can see on the screen there, they can range from $25,000 for an individual or $500,000 for a large corporation, that sort of thing. So keep in mind that they are serious about this. They do want this data from you if you have it, and they do expect you to take some steps to get it. You can see in the corner, I don't think the link will necessarily work for you, but if you go to the Assent's website, there is a blog that we had published that spells out walks through a lot of what I've talked about here, but quite useful. And we can make sure you have the link to that as well if you'd like. Let's see. So yeah, I think it's important to point out who is in scope for this, what type of companies are in scope for this, or what type of activities are in scope for this. In summary, really, there's four, right? You need to understand if it's one of those 312 substances, and it's actually broken into three parts in the regulation. And it's important to point out that PTFE, or polytetrafluoroethylene, that's maybe the most common PFAS in the world today, used in all manner of industries. That is on the list. So that pulls in a lot of companies because they happen to maybe they don't use any other PFAS, but they use that specific one. That pulls them into having an obligation to report here. Then there's there's some substances that are not listed, and so maybe you wouldn't have an obligation there, but then also you need to understand the amount of that specific substance. So let's say you're using PTFE as the example, right? If you, during 2023, you imported, a known amount of PTFE, well, you need to understand what that amount was, do some calculations, and then you'll understand if you're above or below that reporting threshold. Total quantity, of course, And then I think this is an interesting point too. What type of reporter are you? So again, I talked about, there's, obviously they're interested in companies that manufactured PFAS during that time period, of course. I don't believe that necessarily pertains to your industry so much. Importer is something that may affect you, right? If you're bringing in components from overseas or United States or somewhere else into Canada, and you were the importer and responsible for bringing those substances into Canada, you may be in scope because of that. And then also I mentioned this as well, like there's a scenario where maybe you only just used the substance. Well, that may pull you into scope as well. And then type of product with PFAS, that's an interesting part as well, that they just want to understand what type of product did you bring into the country, why was it being used in there, that sort of thing. And is it specifically, so they also they've provided a list of specific product types. I don't think necessarily is going to apply to you. These are very like consumer type goods, like clothing and textile and cookware, personal care items, cosmetics, that sort of thing. So of course, if you manufactured or imported those exact products, you're definitely in scope. But then that's also these other non-listed items that have a different threshold. That's really the main difference. So that was kind of fast, but that was the Canada reporting. I expect that we'll probably have some questions on that as we get to the Q&A, and I'm happy to answer those if I can. I do want to take a drink of water, and then we'll jump into some of the state activities here in the United States specifically. And this is something that we're seeing really proliferate a lot in the last year or so. And the issue is this, right? The EPA at the federal level is conducting this data collection activity, but they're not restricting any substances so far, and they've not even indicated that they plan to. So what states are doing to react to that is states are taking their own initiatives to restrict these substances. And so we've seen that almost every state has either passed or proposed some sort of PFAS legislation. Not all of these are PFAS in products. Some of these are like dealing with PFAS contaminated waterways or PFAS contaminated landfills. But the point is that all these different states, it's on their radar. It's in the public eye. The public is aware of these substances now. And so states are feeling the pressure to take some sort of activity or take some sort of action on it, right? So, are they harmonized? We have 50 states. Unfortunately, they're not. They're close, and they're getting better as we're seeing them roll out. But what we're seeing is that they're starting with, and you may have heard of Minnesota's the number one example, right? Minnesota was one of the first states to come out and fully say or declare that they're going to fully ban these substances at some point, and that is on the books, that they have a full ban in place starting in 2032. So that's still a little ways away. But what they also have done is initially they're targeting those consumer type goods that I mentioned under the Canada reporting obligation. So these are, again, clothing and textiles, rain jackets, ski wax, cosmetics, other personal care items, that sort of thing. Cookware is a great example. So what we're seeing at the state level is that states are harmonizing on that front too. They're targeting those, more or less low-hanging fruit first, or maybe another way to think about it is they're targeting things that it's not where these substances are not critical to the functioning of the product, right? So we're seeing that sort of harmonization happening. Not exactly. I mean, it's not a perfect match, but we are seeing a lot of states adopt very similar product categories. We're also seeing a definition. We're seeing states use a common definition, which is nice, actually, right? You've seen the difference between how Canada defined it by like giving a list of substances versus what the EPA has done with just this wild chemical structure. These individual states are using more or less the same language to define what type of substances are in scope, which is good, as good as things can be, I guess. The other interesting wrinkle here is that they're talking about intentional use only. And what that means is that they're not interested in contaminants maybe on the surface of an article. Like if you or your suppliers didn't intentionally put the substance there, they're not too concerned about that. They're focusing on intentional usage of these substances. And then there also is some language about these currently unavoidable use exemptions. Maine is the one that had that first, and really what that means is they're gonna ban these substances, but if you can prove to the agency that you have a use of that substance that you cannot get out of and it will dramatically impact your business to not sell it, they may give you an exemption to continue to use that after the phase out period. So this is a busy slide, I'm aware, but just to point out that lots of states are dealing with this. I mentioned Minnesota, and that's not even highlighted here because it's already been on the books for a while. But New Mexico is an interesting one. The governor there in New Mexico has a bill sitting on her desk that will ban PFAS across the board in a relatively short time frame if she signs it. We don't know if she's going to yet, of course. But again, these are all similar bills. But just to point out that this is happening, it's changing all the time. New states are adopting it. It's not just the usual states like California and New York. It's some of these other states that you don't normally consider, activist states that are taking action on these substances. It's states across the board that are starting to deal with these substances because of that lack of federal oversight. So yeah, PFAS and refrigerants. I don't have a lot to share here. I just thought I should add this because it may make sense for you to understand this. But yes, some of the common refrigerants that are used today are considered PFAS by most definitions. So just keep in mind, right? HF 134, HFC 134A. That's the one I'm most familiar with because I came from the automotive industry, and that's the refrigerant that's commonly used there. But that is in scope of almost all definitions. That meets the definition of a PFAS. The other issue is that even if it's not, a lot of these substances, once they're in the environment, can actually break down into trifluoroacetic acid, which is also PFAS. So even if they don't meet that chemical structure initially, once they're in use and once they're in the environment, they actually, in the long term, break down into a well-known PFAS, which is TFA. Yeah, so just examples, right? They're already listed there, but just want to share that. Keep in mind, as you're going through this exercise of wondering how these regulations are going to impact your industry or your specific business. Obviously, I talked about some of the uses at the top, but it's these type of uses as well that you may have to consider. So what should you be doing today to address this? There's a few things you should be doing first and foremost, but let's be clear, right? This is unprecedented from a regulatory standpoint. Companies have never had to deal with this level of scrutiny on a family of substances as large as what this family of PFAS substances is. This is brand new. Most companies, do not understand how to deal with this, right? And on top of it, there's the complex regulatory landscape that I just described. We've got individual states dealing with it. We've got countries dealing with it. I haven't even touched on Europe, which is also dealing with it as well under their REACH regulation. There's also, part obsolescence issues. We're starting to see companies say, "Hey, we don't want to be in the PFAS business anymore." 3M is a prime example of this. 3M has stated that at the end of 2025, they're going to stop manufacturing all PFAS and PFAS articles that they produce. Something like 23,000 different SKUs that they put on the market today are no longer going to be available. So that's going to create part obsolescence and disruptions for all manners of industries that use those type of products. And these are everything from O-rings and seals to PPE for factory workers. It's a lot of different things. And then there's just this overwhelming pressure from, I mentioned the public is obviously aware of these substances. Regulators are aware of these substances. Investors and insurance agencies are now aware that, hey, look, there's litigation out there that companies are facing. So insurance companies are saying, hey, maybe we don't want to insure companies that use these. So this is changing rapidly, but it's not going away. So, how to get started? I think, first and foremost, it's important to start to understand where you have these substances in the purchased materials or purchased components or products that you buy today, and why. It's important to understand why they're there. I think as I talked at the top, right, these are high performance substances used for very specific reasons. And so you should be able to start to, just when you think about that, you should be able to start, your mind should be able to take you to where some low hanging fruit where you might be using these substances. And I think it's also important to point out that don't forget about your MRO, maintenance repair operations in this, right? Because even if they're not part of the reporting obligations, which they may be, but you could face issues about sourcing those parts in the near future as well. So, and of course, understanding the regulatory frameworks, that's what you're here today for. That's all good. And then, you have these look back reporting requirements. So, really what our recommendation is, start somewhere, right? Where do you need more data? Think about how your products are designed. Think about what those specific characteristics that we talked about at the top. And then you can start to say, okay, hey, look, sheet metal, probably not so much a concern. Any type of electronics, that might be something I would focus on. Anything with the rubbers, gaskets, and rubber seals that are meant to keep out air, water, oil, that's stuff that I would focus on. So you can go down that path, right? And then also, talk to your suppliers. If you're going to start to request things from them, talk to their supply chain about why they're going to be seeing these requests from you. They're probably seeing it from other customers of theirs as well. But there's a couple different ways you can go there, right? Then this is some of what Assent does, is supply chain queries, right? We can actually get with a list of your suppliers and part numbers. We can reach out to your supply chain and ask these pertinent questions about these substances and help you formalize some ideas of where these substances are, and then I'll help you meet some of these reporting obligations that you're facing as well. So this is definitely, if in my mind, this is very much so a crawl, walk, run situation, right? So start with the low hanging fruit. Start small, and then start to build up a process to collect this data and understand where these substances are, even if you don't meet those reporting obligations, right? It's important to understand what these substances are, because you may face future inability to put those products on the market in certain jurisdictions or certain regions. You may face obsolescence issues where you can no longer source certain parts, that sort of thing. And then, as you mature and as you get a better idea where these substances are in your supply chain or in your manufacturing process, then you can start to design these out, right? It's going that way, where you're going to have to deal with it one way or another. So the sooner you understand where these substances are in your process and your products, the sooner you can start to think about where you may be able to get them out and avoid any regrettable substitutions, meaning avoid the scenario where you exchange a part that has PFAS and you put another one in it that has another PFAS in it. That's something you don't want to do. So if you have a full picture of where these substances are, that'll help you make better decisions, more educated decisions about how to deal with this moving forward. And just a little bit about Assent. I touched on it a little bit, right? But Assent does this exact thing, right? So we are a company based in Ottawa, so we have a system where we can actually reach into your supply chain by querying your supply chain and pull data from them, collect it all in one spot. Meets all those due diligence requirements that I was talking about for both EPA and SEPA. We have 1,000 employees around the globe. I'm just one of those. I'm one of our experts as well. We have a team of 20 regulatory experts that help our customers with questions, help our customers meet these different reporting obligations, that sort of thing. And I think that's really about it. And I guess one more thing on the PFAS side, we have 2 modules that we use internally at Assent where we actually can collect data from your supply chain using these exact tools. So if that's something that interests you, feel free to reach out to Assent. Feel free to reach out through Matt or Perry at HRAI, and they can get you in touch with somebody at Assent. But yeah, I think that is it, Matt. I see you jumping back on, so I think we can probably jump to the questions at this point.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Craig. First of all, we are putting out a call for questions. If you'd like to ask Craig anything, he is here now at your beck and call. You can ask him in the webinar chat or the Q&A box. Now, do you have Do you have a slide with your contact information, or can we put that in chat somewhere?
Yeah, I can absolutely put that in there. Yes, for sure.
Sure, sure. In case someone just wants to maybe connect with you after the fact. This video will be on HRAI's YouTube page as well. I know Craig had a lot of great information packed in his presentation, so if you need to go over it again, you can find it on YouTube in about a couple hours there. So there it is, craig.howard@assent2s's.com. If you want to reach out about anything further, we'll give a couple minutes for the questions, and then we'll call her a day.
Yeah, I just dropped a couple other things in the chat there that I mentioned during my talk. One is the guidance document for the Canada reporting. Again, it's a very useful document, very well written. I highly recommend if you think you're in scope of that, take a look at that guidance document to help understand what some of the requirements are. And then I also did put a blog in there that we have published about that Canada reporting obligation as well. And one other, while you're on the blog site, if you go there and you're looking around, we have a bunch of other information on that site. If you want more information about the EPA reporting or some of the state level activity, we have blogs for all of those as well.
That's great. We always love webinars like this, informing folks about big developments. So please put your email here, says one of the folks. Where are the links? Oh, you know what? We may have copied those just for our purview. So let me just
Oh, did
repost
we?
those. Yeah, here
Okay.
we go. Don't worry, everyone. We are getting them into the chat right now.
Oh, I see
Okay,
that now. Okay, everyone. There we go.
there we go. Okay, I've got a question coming up here, so give me 2 seconds. This one comes from Robert. Is anyone trying to develop a centralized database of materials, products, etc., that fall under the PFAS program, possibly organized by industry? As time goes by, it seems like those databases would simplify companies' research and subsequent compliance efforts.
There are a couple out there. I would hesitate to say that they're all encompassing, but yes, there. If you go to ChemSec, CHEMSEC, chemsec.org, I believe it's a European agency, nonprofit that's actually doing this exact thing. They have a list of known PFAS substances, and they also have like known like what type of applications those are typically found in. So that's one, but specific to your industry or specific to any industry, unfortunately, I'm not really familiar with that. I will add though, some agencies, there's the OECD list, which is the Office of not Economic Cooperation, something like that. It's a European agency. Again, they have a list of like 14,000 PFAS out there. Some of those are like theoretical; they're not
I'm on the
actually.
camera.
But
Sorry, child
yeah,
walked
no,
in
that's okay.
during our conversation there.
But yeah, so unfortunately, there are some out there, Robert. They're not, it's sort of it's kind of all over the map. You have to do a little research. There's not one handy dandy list of or database that you can touch on that would address that. Unfortunately, I wouldn't be surprised if somebody's working on it, but today I don't know of anything specific that meets that. That kind of covers everything.
Thank you so much. Again, apologies. Got a sick kid at home today, so
No
balancing
worries.
the work life as we talk.
Yeah,
I
no
got another
worries.
one from Jeremy. Let's say I import a valve which has a Teflon gasket. What do I need to declare and to whom?
Yeah, so Jeremy, if you imported that gasket into Canada during the year 2023, you may be obligated to report that to the regulators, right? So what you would have to understand is, and if it is if it's PTFE, if it's 100% PTFE, or if it's whatever that percentage of PTFE, that's something you would need to understand. You would also need to understand the volume that you imported during 2023 because that will define if you're above that reporting threshold or not. And then, what you would report, you would actually, it's quite simple. You would actually, if you are above that reporting threshold, you would go into their template and you would put in, it's as simple as you would put in some information about your business, of course, and some contact information, but you would put in the CAS number, the name of the substance, and actually the template does all that for you. If you type in the CAS number, the template auto populates PTFE if you happen to put that CAS number in there. And then you would just put a concentration if it's known, and then you would put in like a generic statement of what that what that PFAS is in there for. So if it's, if it is a PTFE O-ring, you'd say, yeah, it's in there for as an O-ring to prevent air or dirt intrusion into the assembly, something like that.
Thank you, Greg. Got two more for you. From Ralph, are there fines in the US like Canada?
There are, Ralph. Yeah, thanks for answering that, or thanks for asking that. I didn't put it in the slides, but yes, the EPA under TSCA does have specific fines that they could levy against companies who are found to be non-cooperating with this reporting obligation. The numbers are relatively high, $35,000, something like that per day per individual fine, and it's also varies. Like if it's they can vary it based on if they think that you were being, if you were ignorant of the situation, or if you were being very purposefully ignoring it, that sort of thing. So yes, to answer your question at a high level, there are potential fines for not cooperating or not submitting data.
Wonderful. These are great questions, by the way. We've got 15 more minutes. So if there's anyone who wants to ask, now's your time. One more question. Does the due diligence obligation also apply to the Canadian side, or was that specifically stated just for the US side?
Yeah, so that is I know that slide was sort of a little confusing because it was tied to the US slides, but yes, that due diligence obligation, or methods of collecting data does fall. The Environment and Climate Change Canada has used very similar language in that guidance document, even that I referenced. But in some of the webinars that they initially did, they talked very specifically about reaching out to your supply chain via emails or phone calls, or using a third party to do that work for you. It's very similar. The requirement, or what they want you to do, is very similar. They want you to reach into your supply chain in whatever method. They want you to document the steps you took to gather this information. In the event that, then you have it like a file that they'd say, hey, look, this is all the steps we took to gather this information. Here's the responses we got from company X, Y, and Z. Here's the responses we didn't get from some other companies, that sort of thing. So if you document it all, and again, if you happen to, if Assent is something that interests you, our tool actually would do all that for you, right? We would have that due diligence built. We have that due diligence steps built right into our compliance tool, so that when we reach out to your suppliers, whatever requests we get or don't get would all be documented right in our transaction log.
Thank you so much. There is one question. Can I get copies of the slide for this? What we can do is this video will be made available. You can go through Craig's presentation on HRAI's YouTube page. So if you need to go through the presentation again, it'll be there. That sound about right, Greg?
That's correct. Yep. Perfect.
Yeah. One from Ralph. If you assemble products in Canada but export them, would they need to be reported?
That's an interesting question. You probably would need more information to answer that, Ralph, because if you're assembling some component and you were including some sort of, let's say, a PFAS gasket into that you sourced in Canada and then exported it, there's really nothing there that you would have to report. You may have a usage obligation to report there, but the export alone does not trigger a reporting obligation.
From an anonymous attendee, for the 2023 reporting, is it based on what we purchased or what we sold?
So it's really based on it's not based on what you sold. It would be more based on what you purchased, and more specifically, it's more based on what, articles that you purchased that were coming into Canada from outside of Canada, right? So if you could say with certainty that like 100% of the parts that we put into our component are sourced in Canada, you may be out of scope completely in that scenario. In our globalized economy, that's probably unlikely, right? You're probably going to have some sort of products or some sort of semi-components that are coming in from out of country. So it's really about what you purchased that were not in Canada and that were brought into Canada, and that you were specifically responsible for bringing them into Canada.
All right. I think this might be the last question, unless more come in. Hello. If the supplier replied that they don't intentionally use PFAS in their products, are we free from reporting?
Uh, Great question. Maybe. So for the EPA reporting here in the States, not necessarily, right? That reporting, you may need to ask some more questions in that scenario, right? Because there may be some contamination or things like that. But uh, for the for the Canada reporting under SEPA Section 71, um, if it's not necessarily that it's intentional or unintentional, but there is a lower threshold, meaning if the PFAS that was added is very small, you may not have to report it at all. And so when you think about intentional versus unintentional, if they're intentionally adding this substance at such a low level, I would question that, right? Because these are substances that are, they're used for a very specific purpose, meaning that they're usually used at a pretty identifiable concentration. So if they're saying that they're unintentional or they have no intentionally added, I would certainly file that away in my file of documentation. I may go another step further and ask a couple clarifying questions of that supplier just to flesh out the whole picture.
I spoke too soon, Craig. We got two more questions for you.
That's all right.
This is great. Thank you so much for everyone participating. One of them from an anonymous user. You mentioned we could use Assent to help with this. What experience does Assent have with Chinese suppliers?
Great question. I would say a fair bit. We do have Chinese language capabilities internally here at Assent. So obviously China manufactures and sells all types of products to all industries. So you certainly wouldn't be the first one to have us reach out to your your suppliers that are based in China. We do that every day.
Okay. If shipping products to Canada, is the reporting burden on the manufacturer or importer, distributor, contractor, etc.?
Yeah, this one's pretty clear, right? It's the importer, but more specifically, the agency refers to the business that is responsible for that product coming into Canada. Um, Oftentimes, that may not be the importer, right? You may buy that from a distributor. Maybe you actually bought it from you went online and bought it from some website here in the States, and then you paid for it online. You would have the reporting obligation in that scenario because you were the business that were responsible for bringing it into Canada. Now, if that was reversed, right, if this business here in the States shipped it to their own warehouse in Canada and you bought it from that Canadian warehouse, the obligation would be on them because they're the ones who were responsible for bringing it into Canada. So it's going to be a little bit dependent on the situation, unfortunately.
Thank you. One from Matt Walsh. Are the exemptions based on the mass percentage of the end product? For example, our equipment may weigh 100 kilograms, but contain less than 0.01 grams.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's a fantastic question, Matt. Yes, it is based on mass, but it's not based on mass at the end of the product, right? It's based on the mass. Ideally, it's based on the mass of the lowest article where that PFAS is found. So, if your final assembly weighs 100 kilograms, but there's a sub-assembly, like an O-ring in there that contains 1% of PFAS, they're really looking for you to focus in on that O-ring and the PFAS in that O-ring. You may not know that though. Realistically speaking, right? You may not be able to get to that level of detail. So it could be that you end up having to just like the only thing we know is the full weight. So again, if that is your scenario, I would encourage you to document all those calculations that you did to come up with whatever determination that you come up with, just so that in the event you got any questions, you can point to some evidence to say, hey, look, we took all these steps. Here's our math. We didn't understand the weight in that component because we couldn't get that information for whatever reason. Again, just document what you did, and you probably should be all set. We got one more here.
We got one more. Could you expand on the difference between the PFAS listed in Part 1 versus Part 2 and 3, as there are different minimum requirements for these 10 grams versus 100 grams or kilograms?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think what it boils down to is I think the PFAS in Part 3 are like fluoropolymers, meaning they're actually like plastic type hard parts, whereas the other Part 1 and Part 2 are more, maybe raw materials. that's sort of that's I don't want to be too misleading there, but I think really that's what it boils down to. I'm pretty sure like PTFE is found in part 3, if I'm not mistaken, and I think that's the fluoropolymer section. I think if you go to that guidance document that I shared, they get into that into how they delineated between the 3 categories or the 3 lists, but yeah, I think that's it. And I don't have unfortunately I don't have quite enough clarity on that off the top of my head. I'd need to go back and look at it to give you a more concrete answer.
Wonderful. Well, you certainly provide a lot of clarity information. So we really thank you for coming today, Craig, and for imparting.
Absolutely happy to be here, Matt. Thank you, and I appreciate all the good questions. I appreciate giving me the opportunity. And yes, if there's anything else that I or Assent can help out with, feel free to. You have my contact information. We'd love to hear from you.
Fantastic. Thank you again, Craig. Thanks to everyone who showed up, asked those wonderful questions. This will be up shortly on our YouTube page, and reach out if you got any further questions. Until then, if you got a webinar you'd like to put on, reach out to myself, Matthew Bradford, through HRAI, and we'll get you up on the big screen like Craig here. But until then, have a great day. We'll talk soon. Cheers.
Thank you.